I'm Patricia McDonald, director of the Ulrich Museum, and if you haven't noticed, all of us are elevated a couple of inches off the ground because we pulled off a spectacular quixotic performance event on Saturday night. Many of us in the audience experienced that, and we just wholly transformed the McKnight Art Center atrium. It was so spectacular. And I felt that night, that performance epitomized the best of the Ulrich mission in that we introduced new artists and really a new art form to Wichita. We served the artists by helping them inch into a whole new audience and Wichita. We're certain we're getting them back. And we gave them the challenge of adapting to a new space. And I just love events like Saturday night where I'm able to look around and, as I say, we have men in suits and people with piercings. and absolutely everybody in between. And the good news about the event was the fire marshal did not shut us down, which was something that, I was sweating that whole time. So. I want to thank all of you in the room, our very loyal salon members, because you know well that events like Saturday night do not happen without you. All of you care so much about the visual arts and the importance of enriching the quality of life in our city that you step forward and you give generously, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for that. There's another reason why I'm not 1 inch off the ground, but maybe 3 inches off the ground this evening, and I just have to share my good news with you. This afternoon, we received news that the Ulrich Museum received a $150,000 grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services to help us with our Moreau Conservation Project. That's my happy dance. Chris Brunner up here is, is she going to do that happy dance or not? Well, but it's really this has been just an exquisite month for the Ulrich in that in the early part of the month, we received a $100,000 grant from the National Endowment for the Arts for our Moreau Conservation Project. So within this month, we've just gotten such an incredible shot in the arm for that important project because all of us in the room know that we are on the path to save a world masterpiece. So I can barely contain myself. With that, and I can barely contain myself because we have Richard Anders with us tonight, a man that I can barely tell you how much I admire. Actually, when I was originally thinking about who to invite, thinking about an entire year of exploring the subject of public art, Richard came immediately to mind, and the thought was that we would have him at the very beginning of the year because he would sort of catapult us into public art as a survey of what has been and what's out there. And then reality sets in, and there's complications in people's schedules, and so ultimately what we've done is we've saved the best for last. Richard, in the early years of his career, he started as the person who managed the Art in Public Places program for the city of Seattle. So a Percent for Art program for governmental projects that were happening that, a minuscule amount, but still significant enough, went to making art happen with new buildings for the city of Seattle. And it has become we could say one of the national models, really the national model for the United States. From 1984 to 1987, he packed his bags and, circled around the kids and got them to come, and the wife, and got them to come too, and went to Washington, D.C., and he was the director of the visual arts program for the National Endowment for the Arts. And then the lure of the West and Pacific Northwest got him back to Seattle. He became the director of the Henry Art Gallery, which is the University Art Museum for the University of Washington. He was 20 years at the helm, and folks, he built an empire. He just wholly changed that organization. The staff increased from 5 to 40. He quadrupled the gallery space when he built, we might call it an expansion, but when you add on sort of 3 times more space as the original building, that's sort of a new building that comes over the original building with the architect Charles Guafmi. And he increased the endowment from 100,000 to 10 million. He put this museum on the map, but also for amazingly adventuresome projects that were thoughtfully conceived and then excellently executed. And I'm not even going to go into the exhibitions that he curated and essays that he wrote and exhibitions that he put on national tour. And you can imagine if you had this kind of life history, people all over the country, and certainly in the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast, would get you on the radar screen. And so when a really substantial public art project would happen, you would think of calling up Richard Andrews to make certain that he was on your selection committee. So he's also connected with so many others and a good number of projects that he's going to share with you this evening, but really incredible art projects here, there, and everywhere. He's consulted on public art in Los Angeles and Boston. He's a new consultant for the Gates Foundation Project and other entities. And he's going to share with us, he retired, actually maybe he just left the museum, he didn't really retire, but he announced it as a retirement, at a very youthful age, a couple of years ago. And he shifted to become the president of the Skystone Foundation, and then is working with the artist James Terrell to transform a crater in remote Arizona into a series of art encounters. And having peeked at his slides and talked with him at lunch, he's going to talk about that particular project as well. And with all that, his energy and charm is just extraordinary. Please help me to welcome to Wichita and to the stage, Richard Andrews.
I'm not that good. I don't know what she's talking about, but sounds like a nice guy. So it's really fun for me to be here in Wichita. I was saying to Patricia that when I was at the NEA, which was quite a while ago, as you probably gathered from that litany, I was head of the visual arts program, which is the program that supported living artists. And so I traveled extensively. And so sometimes I come to a city and I think, have I ever been to this city before? And I have to look around and think, I don't think so. I don't think I've seen any of this before, because at least I have a visual memory. And as I get older, the other parts of my memory are certainly going, like names and faces and things like that, but I can usually remember where I've been. So I think I've never been to Wichita. So it's really been a pleasure in my less than 24 hours that I've been here to drive around and be part of the city here. I need to do this to start with. So I know you're going to hate that because I went away from the microphone. What I want to talk about is my sort of working title is Public Art and the Art of Engagement. And this is a new talk for me about a subject that, of course, I've thought about over the years quite a bit. So it's more of a sketch than a fully fledged lecture, but let's go into it. And I like the word engagement as applied to our experience of art in public places, as it is a gentle word that suggests cordial interactions between art and observer, or, as in getting engaged, maybe even intimate connections that preface a commitment to a lasting relationship. Webster's dictionary defines engage as occupy or involve, as in someone's interest or attention, and to engage in as to participate or become involved in. Both terms, I think, nicely describe the first step in an aesthetic experience, whether it's public or it's private. Public art is primarily an art of engagement. By definition, it is art that exists in or is expressly created for civic space and it is aimed at a diverse, shifting, and often distracted population. Given the public setting, it is rarely an experience of quiet contemplation. And in thinking about the many ways that art might engage a public audience, I found it useful to construct a framework for my thoughts. And this presentation suggests a broad range of ways we might discover and experience art in the public realm. We can imagine the different ways we might engage with a work of art, or from the other side, different ways artists might try to engage us with art, ideas, history, and even the universe that contains us. Our relationship with any work of art is primarily a personal and private aesthetic experience. But when that experience takes place in a public setting, rather than a studio, home, or museum, there are additional challenges for both artist and audience. The familiarity that we all have of a one-on-one experience with a single work of art in a private setting does find a parallel in the classic object in the plaza that initiated the public art movement in the United States in the middle of the last century. This, of course, is Picasso's work in Chicago that was done in 1967. And this work, I think, kind of followed the line of reasoning. If the Picasso worked in the living room, well, why not in the public plaza? And in fact, this particular project was the impetus behind the buildup of modern art in public places projects of the 1960s, which was partially an urban renewal program for many of those awful squares and public spaces that had been created in the 1940s and 50s, and partially a mitigation, therefore, through art of the starkness of the ubiquitous plazas surrounding international-style glass towers. Done well, as it was here, it can be a spectacular addition to the public landscape. Done badly, it degenerates into what became known as plop art. This is not plop art. This is another spectacular example in Chicago of a work of art, a single or singular object writ large, but made expressly for architectural space, urban space, the grand landscapes that we all inhabit in our in the public world we live in. This is called Cloudgate, and it was done in 2006. Familiar to you all, I'm sure. The 1970s were a crucial period of investigation of the role of contemporary art and artists into new modes of public art. It was a particularly fruitful time. Artists explored a wide range of materials, venues, and approaches that tested the boundaries and the traditions of public art. The earthwork and land art experiments of the 1970s defined an art that was integral to place and described as, quote, site-specific. Site-specific means just that. Artwork created in response to the particular physical characteristics of a place, such as function, geography, environment, etc., but generally not the social characteristics of the site, how it's used, who lives there, that sort of thing. Others, such as Richard Serra, made large-scale sculpture using industrial methods and materials, such as steel and metal fabrication, creating works way too large for interior spaces and much more suitable for outdoor presentation, creating a whole new body of work that could exist in the public realm. In 1981, a young college student, Maya Lin, leapt to national attention with her design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. This was the result, as many of you may know, of an international competition, and she won as a completely unknown design student. It is a breathtaking achievement as both a work of art and a memorial, and it stands as one of the important markers of American 20th century public art. She was steeped in the minimal aesthetic of Barnett Newman and Richard Serra, informed by the earthworks of Robert Smithson, and certainly indebted to the sensibility of Isamu Noguchi. But Lin managed to do what many felt was absolutely impossible. That is, to infuse an abstract work of art with the content of memory and national mourning. Those of you old enough, and there are at least a few in the audience old enough to remember when this was opened and perhaps remember your own first experience of the work, know how incredibly moving it is. And Maya talked about this project she imagined in her one paragraph explanation that went along with her design entry. She imagined, as she said, a knife cutting into the earth and creating this V-shaped form, and the surface would be polished, creating a tension between the place of the living and the place of the dead. But the thing that was not understandable, because there was so much controversy as this was being created, was that the finished work, the highly polished surface of that finished work, created this mirror that reflected back the faces of the living on top of the names of the dead. And as you know, it's chronological from the middle. It's like a book. It's chronological. First dead here, reads out to the corner, returns, and the last dead is here. So it's a circular, it's a V, but it's a circle. Maya has gone on to design many other important monuments to civil rights and other historical individuals. But most recently, the Confluence Project along the 300 miles of the Columbia River between Washington State and Oregon marked the 200th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition. She was selected. There was much to do in our zone of the Northwest about this Lewis and Clark thingy coming up, and much pushback from the tribal populations, environmentalists, and many other people who thought maybe this hadn't been such a good idea, this whole push into the environment. And it was one of the tribal leaders who came forward with the idea that Maya Lin should be asked to create a monument or a memorial for, or a marker in a sense, for this 200th anniversary. And that person felt that there was nobody in the tribal community, nobody in the white community, none of the celebrants of the Lewis and Clark expedition itself that could appropriately address the internal conflicts that occurred because of the travels of Lewis and Clark. So 7 sites were selected by Maya along the project. It's called the Confluence Project because it's the confluence of the expedition, the flora and fauna that existed at the time they went through, and the tribes that existed there. So at each one of these 7 sites, there are different ways that those 3 elements are threaded together. And so she began at the end. She began where they tumbled out onto the beach near Astoria, where the Columbia River goes into the Pacific Ocean. And she took over, there was a pre-existing parking lot and fish cleaning station. The fish cleaning station looked like somebody had gone to Home Depot, honest to God, bought the stainless steel double sink and some pipe, put it on the pipe, turned on the water, and people would be happily cutting up their salmon and throwing the bodies into the water. She created this extraordinary cut basalt bench, or not bench, cut basalt fish table with running water so that you can clean your fish. But importantly, inlaid into the surface is a text, which is the creation myth text of the tribes in that particular, they're actually not an actual tribe, but the tribal communities in that particular area. And interestingly, their creation myth is all about the slicing into the salmon, the creator slices into the salmon, and out of the salmon emerges their people. So it's this very beautiful object that she's created that brings together not only the words of the native peoples, but here, as is the case of all the sites, the text, some of the text from the actual Lewis and Clark journals. Thank you. And here, near that same site, oh, I guess I could look down there. Near that same site, she wanted to recognize the fact that when Lewis and Clark traveled down the Columbia River, they passed not only thousands of different flora and fauna, but thousands and thousands of peoples who are pretty much not mentioned in the journals. But more importantly, of the some 30 or so tribes that had been in existence at that time, only 11 or 12, I think, are still in existence. So she found a cedar log. A chunk of the cedar log is in the center of this point, that was old enough, it was a log that was laying there that was cut open by counting the rings. That tree was alive when Lewis and Clark came down to that point. And she found and dragged up these fallen cedar logs there to represent the tribes that are missing. And here is this is now finished, but this is the rendering of it. This is a bird blind, so this is a different site. And on this bird blind, you can walk up into this bird blind's wood timbers and look out through the slats, and it's on an estuary, so you can see lots of birds. But on the vertical slats on the inside, each one has the name of a species, as it was described by Lewis and Clark, who were inventing names as they went along if they didn't know what it was, the scientific name, and also its current status, whether it exists or it's extinct or it's endangered. For every animal named by Lewis and Clark on their entire trip. And I believe, partially because of Maya Lin, who I think reinvented the monument in our own times, that the monument remains a very important form of public art, as these are the works that proclaim who we are, or who we think we are, and what we choose to remember, not only for ourselves, but for future generations. A kind of twist on that is the work of Ai Weiwei, who's a Chinese artist who you may have heard about. This is called Circle of Animals or Zodiac Heads. And here he recreated in bronze 12 animal heads that had once adorned the Zodiac fountain in the old summer palace in Beijing. They originally cast around 1750, but then were looted by Anglo-French troops in the 1860s. And these heads remain one of the sort of potent symbols of nationalist sentiment in China. And this very work suggests his revisiting, recasting, and transforming these works suggests a dialogue about the fate of artworks in the volatile cultural and political settings. But as you probably also know, that Ai Weiwei was put in prison in China and is now under house arrest, has been for about a year, for his outspoken views on human rights in China and artistic freedom. And so in a sense, this installation, which happens to be at the LA County Art Museum and has moved to a variety of different museums and different public settings around the world, this work actually becomes a kind of monument to Ai Weiwei, the artist. Another form of public art that arose out of the experiments of the 1970s were works that engaged the daily life of the community, emphasizing local impact, problem solving, collaboration between artists, architects, engineers, and city planners. Seattle's public art program became well known for its very early efforts to support this approach, and created what became known as design teams, that is to say, putting artists along with the architects and engineers that were designing public spaces and public facilities. The very first of these was what is lovingly called the Wuhlen-Hoffmann Electrical Receiving Substation. And this was a gift to a neighborhood who didn't really, the gift to a neighborhood of an electrical substation. So you had to clear out some houses, open up a little space there, and drop in this electrical substation, which utilities are prone to do to bring electricity to the neighborhoods. And so the imposition or the inclusion, let's say, of the artists, Sherry Markovitz, Andy Keating, and Buster Simpson on this design team completely changed the interaction of the entire design team itself. And so instead of doing what normally had done, which is to put the big electrical stuff behind big brick walls and kind of whistle and pretend it doesn't exist, they opened it up, they made it transparent by putting fencing around and painted the electrical components, all these sort of pastel colors. And in one corner, this is the best part, in one corner there's these whirligigs. There was a folk artist now deceased in eastern Washington who created out of pots and pans and dustpans and things, these little wind whirligigs. And so they decided to put this little collection of these things. And so you had this complete low-tech whimsy in juxtaposed to this high-tech seriousness of bringing power. And the best idea that Buster Simpson had, Buster Simpson has a pretty good sense of humor, he said, you know what, I propose we give power to the people. And utilities said, well, what do you mean? He said, I think there should be utility sockets on the outside of the station that the neighbors can plug into. And the utilities said, I don't think so. But Buster had his own way. He did a number of interventions in the city itself. He just sort of did them. This was a self-watering landscape he did in the 1970s. So he was obsessed with, we're all obsessed with water in Seattle, but he was obsessed with the water going down the drains. And so he created this way of using just commercial pipes so that you could put plants in there, the water would come up, feed the plants, and they would continue on to go out. So this notion of engaging public art through function is one that took on a great life. There's this particularly terrific example in Minneapolis by Sia Armajani called the Irene Hickson Whitney Bridge, done in 1988. And Sia is an extraordinary artist who sees functionality as central to public art. And his art is one that's based on the vernacular architecture of America, and is imbued with both the language and the ideals of poets and philosophers. So this bridge, which is the double chord, typical engineering thing, crossing the freeway there, has also text, which is from John Ashbery, and he believes his art needs to serve through functionality and teach through text. And something completely different. Bruce Naumann's, also done the same year, 1988, Bruce Naumann's Vices and Virtues at the University of California, San Diego, is an interesting example of an artist exploring a traditional form of public art, but with a twist. The tradition is one of carving the advice of the ages into the facades of buildings, and that goes back hundreds, if not thousands, of years in human history. But here, on a university campus, Naumann flashes the 7 vices and the 7 virtues, these essential truths to a youthful audience. So it's lust and greed and hope and charity, and particularly at night, it's on their engineering, particularly at night, it's a giant building. It's this fantastic, it's a great didactic message to youth. And even on a larger scale, so it's this notion of public art as the place itself, using the notion of site specificity that came out of land art and other things, but the idea of functionality as being central created opportunities for artists themselves to actually create whole public places. And one of the ones that's quite striking is Robert Irwin's design for the Getty, which is the central garden of the Getty. And here he, a visual artist, designed this entire landscape. And this landscape is a full public place. It is, it's an oasis in the shell or in the waste of the Richard Meier building. It's a garden for all of the senses. It's for sight, it's for sound of water trickling down, the smell of the flowers. It's truly a symphony from an artist, if you know his work, that is best known for very subtle, discrete interventions in architecture and landscape. And those interventions he's made are always unique responses to place, what he calls site determined, meaning they rise up out of his reaction to a particular place. There's another way, I think, of working with community, and that's to include participation as a fundamental part of the art experience, and to explore the potential of temporary interventions into public spaces. Such interventions interrupt, transform our civic landscapes and engage us with new, unfamiliar, or sometimes uncomfortable visions. Oops. Those things are now completely, grown with bougainvillea. They're spectacular. This was taken just after it opened. So the fourth Plinth is a project in London in Trafalgar Square that began in 1999 or so. It's a brilliant idea, really. There are 4 plinths that were built as part of the design of Trafalgar Square, but one of them remained unfinished. Nothing was actually put on it. It was designed, the so-called fourth plinth, was designed for an equestrian statue, but it was never funded, never completed. So it sat empty for decades and decades and decades. And somebody had the bright idea of running a competition or selecting a variety of artists who would each do a temporary project. And so this has gone on now for a number of years, and I'm just going to show you a quick set of examples. But for me, it's a wonderful thing. It's this place that existed in the public space that probably everybody ignored. And by the intervention of art, it became now this new focus for contemporary art and for Trafalgar Square itself. So here's Mark Quinn did a sculpture, which is a sculpture of another artist, it's called Alison Lapper Pregnant. And you can see she's pregnant. She has a condition that doesn't make her an easy candidate for large-scale portraiture. Antony Gormley did, I think, one of the simplest but really pretty remarkable ideas. He called it One and Other. And the idea was that for 100 days, he would have volunteers spend 1 hour. They could do anything they wanted. 1 hour up on the plinth, so you can see the nettings in case they fall off. Day, night, 24 hours a day. And 2,400 people volunteered to participate. Some gave speeches, some did performances, some sat, some took off all their clothes. But to me, that's just extraordinary that this work of public art, this idea, this power of this idea of this artist to utilize this space, this plinth, for the people of the community and have them come forward is remarkable. Yinka Schonebert designed a ship in the bottle, and this is really the only one that's actually made reference to Trafalgar Square. So this was done in 2010. So it's a reproduction of Admiral Horatio Nelson's flagship, the Victory, which was at the Battle of Trafalgar, for which there is a Trafalgar Square. So it's this fantastic ship for Admiral Nelson. There is the waterfalls that the artist Olafur Eliasson did in New York City, a temporary transformation of a number of the bridge structures in New York with a lot of plumbing to create these fantastic waterfalls. There's a project that occurred in Seattle that's I think much more poignant and subtle, and this was done in 2002. It was two artists, Bradley McCollum and Jacqueline Terry, came up with this idea. It's an endurance project, was called Endurance. They were working with homeless teenagers, and they created this performance that lasted basically 25 hours, continuous 25 hours. And they had 26 individual homeless teenagers. Each one took their place on the sidewalk in the same place and would stand facing a camera which was invisible to anybody walking by, staring at the camera, saying absolutely nothing. The poignant thing is that each youth dedicated his or her performance to the memory of friends who had died from the life on the streets. In the 21st century, there are new technologies that create, I think, new possibilities for public art, particularly time-based public art. No longer limited to the permanent or the static object, artists can create works for public spaces that utilize virtual space, the internet, and digital image technology. We're beginning to see this everywhere, Second City, all these different kinds, or Second Life? Second Life. Second City is a comedian. Second Life. But this is a piece, not really a work of public art, but this is by an artist, Gary Hill, very important artist who doing media-based works. It's a very big, it's either 60 or 90 foot long, depends on the configuration, black space you walk into, projected images on your right and left. You walk in, there's no sound, but as you walk, if you walk in initially, the figures are static. As you walk, they're seated, they stand up, and they turn, and they sort of slowly walk toward you. And they kind of look at you, and as you move all the way down to the end, at the very end, the dot at the end is a young child, a young girl opening her hands like this. And it's completely open for interpretation, but what's sort of dazzling about it, the first time I saw it, so this is about a 10-year-old work, is you are in a sense, you are the object of their attention. I mean, you feel like you're in some other kind of different world, this black realm that seems limitless with these images, ghost-like images. And I think this suggests the potential for kinds of public arts, kinds of public spaces for that matter, that are yet unknown to us. One of the projects I've done with the Gates Foundation is one of the public works that's at the street level. And I became interested in the possibility of using digital technology and media. So we created a big screen, a digital screen that's at sidewalk level. It's about 12 feet long by 9 feet tall. And a Korean artist, Kim Soo-ja, I had done a piece that I had seen in 2005 that seemed to me absolutely perfect for the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation obviously is directed outward from Seattle toward areas of need, health and education, et cetera, across the world. And it seemed to me that any artwork, public artwork that should, in a sense, be positioned in relation to that building should, at minimum, address the humanistic interests of the institution, but hopefully the global character of what they do. This is a beautiful work that I will illustrate only with slides. So this is the installation. The sidewalk is just in the foreground there, or near the sidewalk. So this is what it looks like there, but it's a beautiful piece. So there are 5 segments to this, each 10 minutes long, and the person you see with the back to you is Kim Soo-ja, dressed the same in each instance, hair exactly the same way, exact same clothes. And she went to 5 cities. She picked these 5 cities because they represented places at risk environmentally or politically. They are in Chad, Yemen, Nepal, Cuba, and Israel. And in each one of these cities, she went alone. She found a videographer, and she did exactly the same thing. She found the main street. She stood in the main street, absolutely silent, absolutely unmoving. So these are videos. Now, they're slightly slowed down. And so what you see is a population coming toward her. Some are interested in her, some try to interact, most ignore and just flow by. And the reason I like this so much for the Gates Foundation is that, in a sense, it becomes a window, a kind of faux window for the Gates Foundation. And if you're in Seattle looking at the Gates Foundation building, looking at this edifice, what you see is the population of the world coming forward toward you, representing all these different cultures of the world. And in a sense, the artist, Kim Soo-ja, is standing in for all of us. She's the witness. And it's called a needle woman in the sense of the needle that binds us all together. So imagine this as a film. So imagine this as figures slowly moving toward you. Cuba. And then here's a work which ought to be a work of public art, I think, because it's such a brilliant, brilliant idea. It's called The Clock by Christian Marclay. This is a line of people in New York when this was first presented in New York, and everywhere it's been presented, it is exactly the same thing. Christian Marclay spent, I have no idea how long, but millions of hours, fragmenting or taking fragments of thousands and thousands of films from all through the history of film. Each one has a reference to time. You know, it's the detective looking up at the clock. It's the bong of the bell. The piece is 24 hours long. Each reference at any second, you look at your watch, and there'll be a watch, or there'll be a clock, or there'll be a reference like the clock that's there, will be exactly the current time. It is 24 hours long, and it's precisely attuned to the 24-hour clock. It's a brilliant, I think it's like the most brilliant piece of public art that could ever be, because it's, so everywhere it's been, there are people going in, going out, 24 hours a day. These are all just vignettes. So just imagine this happening really quickly. If you ever have a chance, Christian Marclay's work is quite good in general, but if you ever have a chance to see The Clock, I absolutely guarantee that you'll be hypnotized by the editing, for one, and the astounding simplicity of the idea and the powerfulness of it. Since it's a video work, it can be owned. I think there are 3 or 4 versions, so it's been purchased by different entities, actually in many cases couples of museums that have put it together. I think I just read recently it's going to go back on view in New York. I can't remember where now. I just read this fairly recently. It's fantastic. I mean, so wherever it is, it becomes a work of public art because the institution or the place has to be open 24 hours to allow people to come in, and people come and go and mingle and do whatever they do in the dark rooms. So that's one way to think about time. That's the kind of time that we're hyper aware of. And I think there's another way to think about time that is not so much about our sense of being caught up in the flow of daily life, with time passing, lost, or surrendered. It lies in the realization that we exist in the fabric of time and space, in the largest possible sense. And this is the realm of physicists, astronomers, and philosophers who seek to understand the very foundation of existence. It's also, I think, a subject for art that engages the self in a manner that requires full concentration and absorption, creating a deep engagement that connects us to the largest frames of existence, the universe, and an acute awareness of our place in it. This, of course, is Robert Smithson's spiral jetty, sometimes visible, sometimes not, in the Great Salt Lake, but I think emblematic of entropy, of change, of life, the spiral form, and lots of different kinds of things. It's actually been my very good fortune to work quite closely with both Maya Lin and James Turrell over the years. And I've curated individual exhibitions of their works, I've written catalogs, and in Terrell's case, commissioned a permanent sky space at the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle. And even though the intentions and interests of these artists, I think, are markedly different, I suggest some overarching ideas that relate to both. Among these are the artists' contributions to the understanding of our relationship to place and the absorption or interpretation of science in art, as well as the blurring of boundaries between art and design. The representation or interpretation of nature is a fundamental subject of art, one that has preoccupied artists for centuries. However, the scope of our understanding of the place we inhabit has grown exponentially in the past 100 years, and now includes images from microscopic atomic structure to galaxies forming outside our solar system, let alone the creation of virtual worlds that would have been inconceivable to artists of previous times. Science has expanded our understanding of the universe, and both Maya Lin and James Turrell readily incorporate scientific knowledge into their work, just as they also look back to ancient earthworks and observatories as touchstones for their art. This is a picture of Maya. We did a very big exhibition of Maya's work at the Henry Art Gallery, and so this is one of the works that we helped create for her, called 2x4 Landscape. And so this is what it looked like in the Henry Gallery. So it is made of 25,000 pieces of 2x4. And so what she was striving for, as she would describe it, is a form, a shape that is between a wave and a hill, between water and earth. And at a distance, it looks like a digital model. She liked to play with that. Is it real? Is it not real? Is it small? Is it big? And it really was an extraordinary, I wish I had more images to show you, but extraordinary form, because it did, at certain approaches, look very much like a wave about to tip over, and others more like the slope of a hill. This is a piece she did in Sweden, I think about 2005, called 11-Minute Line, and she said, to do something that looked both modern and ancient. It is a squiggle form, so kind of abstract form, but it's called 11-Minute Line, and it takes 11 minutes to walk the contour of that line. It's also in a field full of cows, so there's some really cool shots of cows standing on top of it. And the most recent large form work that she's done is called Wavefield, which is at Storm King Art Center in New York State, done in 2010. And Wavefield takes the idea of the 2x4 landscape, is it water, is it land, and extends it out into the landscape form in a very powerful way. So it's this series of waveforms in the landscape. And if you pull back and think about geology and geologic time, and you look at this in the context of the mountains that are behind, rubbed down over the centuries, and you think about how nature, whether it's wind or water or earthquakes or whatever, changes and transforms our landscape. This work is, I think, a very powerful work. When you walk in it and through it, it's as if, those of you who are sailors or I grew up in LA, so I'm a surfer, it's an eerily familiar sensation, except you don't go up and down at all. You're frozen and you walk over these forms. And in the water and the waves, of course, the motion of the wave rides, you're simply bobbing on it, it rides through you. I'm going to conclude with, believe it or not, with Roden Crater project by James Turrell. Over the last 35 years, that's James Terrell, and that's Roden Crater. He's the guy, that's the mountain. He's created works that allow the viewer to apprehend perception, not through a pseudo-scientific exploration of sight's mechanics, but rather through the probing of spaces in which aspects of seeing, from the physiological to the sublime, are revealed. He has said, "My work is about space and the light that inhabits it. It is about how you confront that space and plummet. It is about your seeing." The subject and the material for these works are one and the same, light and space. When Terrell speaks about light, it is often in terms of both physical and psychological characteristics. For example, light is a powerful substance. We have a primal connection to it. But for something so powerful, situations for its felt presence are fragile. I form it as much as the material allows. I like to work with it so that you feel it physically, so you feel the presence of light inhabiting a space. I like the quality of feeling that is felt not only with the eyes. It's always a little bit suspect to look at something really beautiful, like an experience in nature, and want to make it into art. My desire is to set up a situation to which I take you and let you see. It becomes your experience. So Roden Crater. He's been working on Roden Crater for 30 years. And it was envisioned when he was in his late 20s. So his work, if you're not familiar with it, he works with light. So he creates interior installations or sky spaces, which are rooms with an opening above that allows natural light to come in. Each one of these spaces is not what it apparently sees. The very first works he did, to give you a good example, this is not one of them. You would walk into a museum gallery, you would walk into a room, and you would look on the far wall, and there would be a rectangle on the wall. And it might be gray, or it might have a slight red color, or green, or blue, or whatever. And you would say, pretty much an empty room with a painted rectangle on the end of that wall. And 50% of the people, or 25%, might turn around and go out. The smart ones walked in, and when you walked toward it, the closer you got, the more you began to suspect that wasn't quite right. And as you got closer, you realized there's a point where you get close enough and you're looking into what apparently is infinite space. Because what you're actually doing is looking through an opening into another room beyond that's suffused with light without any shadows or imperfections. And it is an extraordinary experience because the light, the color, the rectangle, let's say, feels as if it's part of the wall. It absolutely feels like you could go up and knock on it and it would be solid. You walk up closer and there's a kind of breakthrough moment where you suddenly look into this infinite space. The interesting thing is you can step back and recapture, it sort of snaps back into being a flat, hard surface plane. So he wanted to create a work of art that was in the natural environment, that utilized not only his understanding of how to make light and perceptual experiences for you at an aesthetic level, but also his extraordinary knowledge of celestial observatories, ancient celestial observatories, so-called naked eye observatories, that is to say, your Stonehenges and Jaipur and places like that where the unaided eye for centuries has looked up to identify its relationship, our relationship, to the cosmos. So Roden Crater, this is a picture taken by him in the 1980s, overlaid with a basic site plan of what's happening. It's outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, about 6,000 feet. It's a cinder cone in a volcanic field. Some quick pictures showing the crater itself. So this is way more complicated than I have time to allot to this. Basically, there are three phases. Phase one is done. So I'm going to show you phase one and a few drawings of the next phase. About midway up the flank of the crater is what's called the South Lodge. And this is a view across the Painted Desert. That's the Navajo Reservation there on the left. And the South Lodge is a place where you will ultimately be able to spend the night. There are 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a nice kitchen. It's a fully functioning crater. And this is the interior there, all designed by Terrell. And this looks at that same observation point, but looking to your right, those other mounds are other cinder cones in the San Francisco volcanic field. distant view. This is at sunset of the crater. The darker formulation is an early cinder cone that was black. The secondary taller one is red. Where they come together, it's this beautiful thing with absolutely red cinder coming to touch black cinder. It's fantastic just as a crater. It's a good crater. A plan showing, and if you can see the numbers at all, from what's built is from 5 to, I can't see them, but 5 to 8 to the dead center. Doesn't look much in the scheme of things, but actually it includes a 900-foot long tunnel and 3 very significant spaces. So right now you enter in at the point called 5, and you enter in, so this is a diagram essentially, cross-section. The roundish shape on the far right is not constructed. Everything else pretty much is. Another diagram here. So I know I'm going to do something that they don't want me to do, but here I go. This space is called the sun and the moon space. This is the long tunnel that's going up. The dotted line is a reference line to the light of the moon that's way up there. That light is passing through a portal up there in the upper left-hand corner. So, and in the sun and moon space is a vertical stone called the image stone. Now, when you, let me go back. So, right now you enter into this space, a circular space, and you can see on the upper picture how the tunnel begins to angle uphill a little bit. You look up that tunnel. The bottom shot is what it seems like, or what it is when you're beginning. The going upwards is you're moving up the ramp of the tunnel. So it's 900 feet long. It's quite a long tunnel. And as you get toward the end, you recognize that the circle is slowly and mysteriously and kind of magically shifting into an ellipse. But so the top picture is you're getting close to the top of the ramp. And now you see this elliptical form. It seems to be it's a flat form at the end on top of this shiny bronze form. And then as you get to it, you realize, in fact, what you're seeing is not, and you're not looking at a flat wall, you're looking at an elliptical hole in the ceiling that by being seen on the angle causes it to look like a circle to you until you approach it. And then the circle breaks, basically slides open into an ellipse with this bronze stair. And turning around, that's the round upper part is where the light comes down. So this tunnel looks at a spot in the sky where every 18.6 years, the moon is as far in the southern sky as it gets. So the moon actually oscillates over an 18.6 period to a northern and a southern position. The southern one is called the southern lunar standstill. So it gets over there, it stays there for a few months, and then it works its way back for 9 years and then back again. So there's a point in the sky where that moon travels, and this tunnel is looking at that spot. There's also a point in that same sky where the winter solstice sun passes. So you imagine like a cross where those two things would pass, and essentially this tunnel is looking at that spot. So every 18.6 years, or every year on an annual basis for the solstice, the light travels down, let me go back one, through that elliptical opening, all the way down the tunnel, and images on that stone. And what you get is about a 4-foot diameter image, let's say, of the moon moving across, kind of like a 19th century black and white film. Were there black and white films in the 19th century? Yes, early ones. So that's simply one of the things that's happening in this particular space. There's the image stone, so there's where the image would come across. There's another space that's directly under the bowl of the crater. So millions of cubic yards of earth were moved to shape the bowl of the crater for certain perceptual effects. And under the center of that is called the eye of the crater. It's a circular sky space. A sky space is a room with an opening to the sky. There's no glass, there's no scrim, there's no material whatsoever, but it's a knife edge. And so what it appears as if the sky is the ceiling. It's a very interesting phenomenon. It appears as if the sky is a hard physical substance. At sunset in these sky spaces, so you sit, there's a bench around the perimeter, that's black cinder at the bottom, that's the same shape. And at sunset, it goes through a series of light changes. And what I can't show you, that is impossible to show you through slides, is the tonality of the light and the intensity of the light and the different kinds of perceptual phenomena that occur when you're so intently looking at the sky in this kind of framing device. This is a rendering of the upper part of the crater. The green sort of globy thing is a conceptualization of what's called the doming of the sky. So if you've been out, probably in the prairie, certainly in the ocean, any great vast distance, you have the sensation that the sky is domed over your head. This is a common human phenomena. And so he's created the central light area is where that other space emerges into the crater. And on the perimeter of it are a series of these things that look like young virgins need to be placed there for specific events, but in fact it's not based on that. You lie there with your head reclining, and what you're looking at is the edge of the crater. The entire edge of the crater has been made perfectly level, but the bowl is not circular, it's slightly elliptical. So by changing your position, this doming phenomena either grows or shrinks, depending on your position. This is the one where the light of the moon goes down through it. And I'll end on this. This is the next space to be constructed. It's got many characteristics, but the simplest for me to explain is it's a space that has this kind of shaped thing called a yantra. On the left-hand side, you can see a cylinder sort of thing. That's actually a viewing spot. Let me go back. A viewing spot for a single person. The dotted line that's going up there, it is looking at the North Star. So the North Star is the one star in our sky that's relatively static, at least in our current configuration. And the North Star, of course, is part of the Little Dipper. Ooh, thank you. Almost lost that. So when you look through the viewing apparatus, so this shows the astronomy part of it, you're looking up through a cylinder, through that little elliptical ring, which, because you're reading it on the side, looks like a circle, and the size of that ring is sized to the size of the Little Dipper. And so when you're sitting there and you're looking up there, the North Star will be in the center, and the Little Dipper, as the Earth turns, the Little Dipper will rotate, all staying inside that configuration there. So you have a great sensation then, or great realization of the movement of the stars caused by the movement of the Earth. So here's a better view, or rendering anyway, of that viewing spot. And there's a kind of hypothetical. So that's the next thing we need to build. And let me just conclude by saying, without disavowing the advances of science and technology, both Lynn and Terrell, I think, point to the disconnect between humankind and the world around us caused by the insulating or mediating aspects of contemporary society, from bright lights that block our view of the stars at night to consumption of natural resources here without the knowledge of the environmental degradation there. And what they share in their art is the creation of conditions for us, the viewers, to connect with the planet and the universe, and perhaps even with the elusive now in the contemplative sense. After all, art that's made from earth and sky is both grounded and ethereal, composed as it is of something and nothingness. And it is art whose timeless content will continue to engage the public for generations to come. Thank you.